The Park Geun-hye administration has put an emphasis on creating a so-called creative economy. But will it work? Today on the show, we take a look at the major economic policies of the new government, from economic democratization to creative economy. A renowned economist in Korea, Dr. Choi Sung-hee. On today's After 10, we discuss the creative economy of the new government with Dr. Choi Sung-hee. Dr. Choi, thank you very much for being here today. We appreciate it.
I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting me to this very important program.
Well, we are very happy to have you here. Let's start by talking about economic democratization. Of course, the buzz phrase of the presidential campaign last year. I understand, however, you are not a fan of this concept. You have said before that the economy and businesses can't be democratized. Explain that a little bit for us.
Yes, quick answer maybe it is because economic democracy tries to treat everybody equally, or make economic reward even for everybody, regardless of their different economic achievement, and thereby motivate people to run mad into the sabotage. In the end, it will end up with the economic degeneration. I think I would like to elaborate a little more because it's so complicated issues.
Please.
Let's start with the understanding of economic development process in capitalist market economy. Market system is the mechanism to select the best or better market performance, thereby motivating everybody to work harder and help themselves, through which economy can develop. Economic development is the sort of dynamic process of learning other success know-how and catching up eventually. Market can expedite this process by helping those who help themselves and achieve better outcomes. This process I've called economic discrimination. The grand theory of economic development is, therefore, economic discrimination. Treating performance differences differently is a necessary condition for economic development. However, economic egalitarianism, treating different economic performances equally, is sufficient condition for economic stagnation. According to this theory, economic development necessarily brings economic inequality, which in fact works toward motivation and dynamism of economic development. Economic democracy, therefore, tend to sacrifice economic development. In this sense, economy and cooperation creating economic differences should not be subject to the egalitarian intervention by the government in the name of economic democracy. That's why I'm having saying that economy and cooperation.
There's a lot in there, of course, but I think maybe the question is it's not that it's too fair, maybe that it's unfair, or too fair to everybody, of course, there. You talked about economic stagnation. That, of course, is an issue. In talking about economic democratization, we have to talk about the creative economy. President Park, of course, wants to create one, but when I look at these two concepts, creative economy and economic democratization, it seems like there might be a conflict there between the two. Are these two things mutually inconsistent?
Yes, I think so.
How so?
I have been concerned about that possibility for a long time. But it seems this new government economic democracy is relatively mild compared to the opposition party economic democracy. In fact, new government economic democracy is a sort of extension of fair trade regulation, so that even the phrase of economic democracy isn't needed. To describe their policy package.
Sure, yeah, it has a lot of people scratching their heads, just that term, economic democratization.
Kind of political symbol.
Right, exactly.
Like that. But in any case, I hope even such extended fair trade regulations under the name of economic democracy shouldn't go too far, to the extent that policy disfavors the ones who help themselves and exhibit superior market performances. It shouldn't be forgotten that more good jobs and economic creativity can only be brought about by the better performing corporations.
And if you're talking about the better performing corporations, more often than not, those are the chaebol that we're talking about. The talk of regulating the chaebol to sort of promote this balance between them and the small and medium-sized enterprises. What are your thoughts on that? I can guess and say that you are not a fan of this idea.
First of all, as an economist, I don't really understand what balanced development of large and small enterprise economically means.
You don't get it?
I don't get it.
Right.
Both enterprises are by nature closely interrelated in a very complex manner and should be seen holistically rather than separately. Large corporations as a demander and small corporations as supplier of parts and capital goods need to be in close cooperation, right? Which has been the basis of Korean industrial strength. And I think it is in good shape. Of course, there could arise some conflict, like issues of unfair trade practices between them. But I think those can easily be handled with a stricter enforcement of Fair Trade Act, which is another matter of economic democracy, I think. They grow together as demand and supplier. This logic also applies equally to large exporting firms and small domestic service sector firms.
There's certainly a lot of opinions out there. Our team here at After 10 took to the streets of Seoul to find out what everyday, normal Korean citizens think about this idea of promoting a better balance between large and small companies. Let's have a look.
Major company-oriented growth has its limits. We should develop economic potential by promoting small business.
We're in the midst of economic growth. More support is needed for small businesses to ensure internal stability.
Major companies are taking the lead in Korean society. We should lift restrictions on small and private businesses. We should correct the imbalance of distribution.
We're living in a global era, and it isn't easy for small companies to struggle alone in the world market. We should support major companies, first to ensure a distribution network, and then support small businesses.
I don't think we have an ideal market principle. Government intervention is needed in business activities.
So as we can see from that clip, there are a variety of opinions out there. Dr. Chua, you have a very strong opinion, of course, about these matters. You recently penned a column that took aim at these new chaebol reform measures, things like the prohibition of circular shareholding of major companies, restoring the ceiling on the total amount of shareholding, and separation of financial and industrial capital, to name a few there. When you look at those things, what is your biggest concern?
I mean, in fact, I'm not opposing to the idea to curb the anti-competitive effect which can be produced by those chaebol activities by the strict enforcement of the Fair Trade Act regulations. But you have to understand that those activities are also part of regular, normal business activities, which sometimes help break through to create future industries. Blanket prohibition could help eliminate the possibility of bad effect, but also eliminate the incentive to break through.
Some of the good effects.
Yeah, and therefore harm the economic dynamism. Therefore, one has to be careful that not to forget the economic reality that breakthrough can only be made by the strong capital and cooperation. I'm actually opposing the politically motivated approach to the chaebol regulation, which is generating and appealing to the general public's anti-chaebol sentiment by implying the big corporation is intrinsically immoral compared to the small firms, and the big itself is always the problem. This kind of ideology is fundamentally development unfriendly and should be changed for Korea's future development. Because, as I have already said, development isn't plausible without the growth of firms.
So again, getting back to this idea of punishing the success, that's what you see happening here,
not
ultimately bad effects.
Yeah.
You also mentioned, too, that if Samsung is the problem or a problem, they should create, or more Samsungs should be created. Explain that for us a little bit.
Okay, then now, what to do about the chaebol behavior? In my opinion, the key problem with chaebols is their monopoly position in their respective markets. In other words, we have only too few numbers of jails instead of having too many jails, And this situation leads to the monopolistic market structure. This situation has in fact been created by the government regulations on the mutual and cross entry into others market and industries in the name of regulating economic concentration, such as regulations on the number of subsidiaries, shareholdings, and investment. These regulations, by reducing competitive forces in the 재벌 sector, ironically help 재벌s to enjoy their protected domestic market and to enjoy the room even for unhealthy, unfair, immoral, and or sometimes illegal political lobbying. I have been proposing a new paradigm for 재벌 policy, namely more Samsungs rather than no Samsung for Korea's economic development. Note that problem with 재벌 sector, as I said, in fact too few number of Samsung kind. This policy of more of Samsung kind will help reduce monopoly power, economic concentration, and wipe out even the room for so-called unhealthy behavior. By putting existing 재벌s into head-to-head stiff competition among themselves. To achieve this policy goal, the government has to deregulate 재벌's mutual investment activities into others area and enforce strictly fair trade regulation, preventing their collusion among themselves. If necessary to create more competitive environment, Korea can intentionally invite stronger foreign global competitors into the 재벌 sector. Furthermore, Korea has to adopt an industrial policy to help strong SME to grow to the 재벌, putting competitive forces into the 재벌 sector.
And this is the past, of course.
Of course.
The question now, present day, is what do you do right now to foster these small and medium-sized enterprises to help them get going? What do you do now?
Quick answer is help those who help themselves. Treat SME not equally. Pick the best SME, help them to grow. That's the quick answer.
Help them in what way?
Let's take a look at the Korean experience in the details. During Korea's developmental era, Park Geun-hye government adopted very, very discriminatory industrial policy, which always favor better performing firms and thereby strongly motivate Korean SME to improve upon themselves and to grow. However, look, Korean small firm promotion policies since mid-1980s turned into the egalitarian one-over and distributive support policy, helping all equally without regard to their performances. In fact, we were discriminating the best and better performing firms, and now demotivating SME sector. Note also that at the same time, regulations on the big corporations has begun to be introduced. Since then, we don't see any big corporations of noticeable size emerge from the small firms. So, the policy of more Samsung rather than no Samsung should adopt Park Geun-hye style, discriminatory industrial policy.
President Park's father, of course.
Her father.
Another thing we can talk about too is the investment. You've talked about this before, the attention that these companies, bigger companies, prefer overseas investment to investing domestically. When you see that, what do you see? Why do you think that's happening?
Since 1990, Korean economy began to lose such a virtuous cycle of shared growth, with a declining growth trend and worsening distribution, because Korean 재벌s do not bring in their export revenues into domestic economy anymore to the same extent as before. Why are Korean 재벌s investment escaping from Korea? It's mainly because domestic investment environment for 재벌 has been increasingly worsening, while, of course, their globalization effort has partly aggravated the situation. 재벌 regulation on various investment activities, balanced regional development regulation prohibiting large corporations' factory expansion in Seoul and Gyeonggi-do metropolitan region, strong militant labor union, which the companies limited freedom to discharge, and public and political sectors' anti-재벌 sentiment, always pressing for stronger regulation on them. All these regulations are contributing to the worsening of 재벌 investment environment.
So the ultimate question comes down to what these companies need, what they want in order to grow and prosper and expand. The Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry recently conducted a survey on 300 domestic companies, asking them what they wanted, what they expected from the new Park Geun-hye administration in terms of economic policy. What came out was something called PLEASE. It's an acronym for 6 of these items and what they're looking for. One of them at the top there, the P, the polarization. They're looking for resolution of that resolving of that polarization. They're also looking for new growth engines. They're looking for an expansion of the investment incentives, something that you talked about. Alleviating regulations was the 4th one. Service industry innovation. They're looking for ways to innovate in the service industry there. And then the last one there, stabilizing energy prices, also a concern there among those businesses. When you look at this chart, when you look at these things, what do you see in terms of what the companies are saying?
It seems to me this survey implies that the business sector already understands what's the problem with the Korean economy.
They're hitting the points that you were talking about.
What needs to be done, right? I think what government should do is to get together with the business leaders and ask, what do you want for more investment in Korea? Answer is there, right? But usually it's so difficult to be swallowed from the political standpoint.
Maybe they're not listening. Is that what you're saying? The government?
Yeah, government can listen, but political sector is not really ready to take those kind of suggestions because they have to look to other demand from the other side,
Right.
labor and other, other sector.
It's complicated.
Yeah, so it's complicated. It's politically complicated.
Sure. I mean, the whole situation, of course, is complicated. When you look at the problems, the polarization, the unemployment of young people, increasing household debt here in the country, the Korean economy, when you look at these things, is facing an uphill battle in many ways. When you take a look at the steps being taken by Park Geun-hye's administration, what do you see as far as being the solution? What are the solution to these things, these problems?
Judging from standpoint of my, what I have said, the answer is so simple. To answer to that, these issues are so simple, but it's difficult to implement from the political standpoint. All these problems, polarization, unemployment of young people, household debt, and lack of growth, it's all stem from the single most important economic reality that Korean economy has been losing the power to create more jobs, right? We have to provide better domestic investment environment for the companies which are able to invest regardless of their size. Don't approach this issue from the political populism by saying, big and able companies shouldn't invest more. We need more investment of small firms to have a so-called balanced economy. Investment for more good jobs can only be brought about by strong, competitive companies which are able to invest. Okay? It's the time, I think, to rethink corporate policy, including chaebol issues, from their consideration of job creation and development revival. Dismantle, I think, we have to dismantle all those complicated regulations which have been aggravating investment environment and deregulate economy so that more investment activities will follow. The prospect to adopt this approach seems very slim to me due to the populism in Korean politics.
The political machine is sort of causing problems with this process here. You're talking about the solution there. President Park has also talked about the solution. She's talked about an economic revival, a second miracle on the Han River. Some people view this as her trying to recreate sort of the achievements of her father, Park Geun-hye. What is your biggest concern about the policies here as you see them, about President Park's idea of where things are going?
The biggest concern for me, sometimes the people are saying she might follow her father's legacy.
Right.
But my concern is opposite.
That she won't follow the legacy.
Yeah, that's my concern. If you look at his campaign promise, she shows some kind of populistic posture with regard to economic management, including, of course, economic democracy. And she's so firm in keeping her promises, right?
Sure.
But those kind of populistic exposure, posture, goes against the developmental the principle, as I already mentioned, okay? And so I would like to advise her to follow her father's legacy in spirit, in strategy and theory. Let's see, what's the success factor of her father? I think it's the dicta that God help those who help themselves. Don't reward the bad behavior, economic behavior, but never forget to reward good behavior. Never yield to egalitarian populism. This spirit has to be re-implemented into Korean economic policy management. Of course, details of tool, measures cannot be replicated because of different economic environment
Circumstances,
right now.
sure.
But in terms of the theory and strategy, those economically discriminatory sort of spirit, okay, not only in economic policy area, but also in even social policy has to be re-implemented to revive Korean economic development.
So you would like her to take a page out of her father's playbook in terms of these things. We are running short on time, but one quick question, one more here. Imagine for a moment that I am not sitting here, that it's actually President Park Geun-hye sitting here.
Yeah.
You've got her ear. What advice do you give her about where you want things to go?
Well, as I already implied in the previous answers, I hope the Korean government changes Korea's current policy regime of egalitarianism to the regime of economic discrimination, which was the success key of the former President Park's economic policies. To this purpose, government should always help those who help themselves. If the policy goals, such as small firm centered economy, creative economy, job creation, etc., are to be successfully achieved, government needs to implement the economically discriminatory policies. I hope President Park do not discard the father's legacy in the name of democracy or even economic democracy, but learns the success know-how from that for the revival of Korean economic development.
Dr. Chua, we'll see if President Park is listening to you in the coming months and years to see how this plays out. We do appreciate you being here today to provide your insights. Thank you.
I hope so. Thank you for your invitation.
Thank you. And thank you, as always, for watching. We'll see you next week after 10.
I hope President Park puts more effort into stabilizing the livelihoods of the people so that the standard of living improves across the board.
Many people say that the economy is in bad shape. I hope I don't have to hear those words anymore.
My hope is to have major companies and small businesses coexist. Solutions are needed to narrow the gap between the urban and rural communities, as well as the rich and the poor.
We need a more equitable distribution of wealth. Korean society needs fairer distribution.